Good morning and welcome to the National Museum of Computing on Bletchley Park. I am here with Sir Dermot Turing, who I'm absolutely delighted has taken the time to talk to you, potentially, about this big thing, cybersecurity. So I'm hoping that you all like cake. So mid-morning, we're going to have some cake, but Dermot's brought his own cake, and maybe he can give you a snippet of the slices and tell you how this has been made up.
Okay, so this is, I don't know whether you can see what's written on the slices, you probably can't, and I've got an absolutely microscopic laptop. I can't figure out what's on the slices, but this is, the idea behind the cake is that there's a sort of a popular perception about what Alan Turing stands for. And we might do some of these things. So how many of you, let's do show of hands, how many of you would say that Alan Turing is a code breaker? None of you. That's a very interesting audience. Okay, let's try this one again. How many of you think that Alan Turing is a code breaker? At least 4 of you. Good, well done, well done. How many of you would associate him in some way with computing? Oh, quite a few more. All right, well done. That's because we've got a slightly self-selecting audience here. Okay, how many of you would associate him with gay rights? You're all a bit more sort of tentative about that, aren't you? That's quite interesting. What about something like Riemann's zeta function? Well, that's interesting. Okay, no takers. Artificial intelligence? Yeah, okay. I've got my slices roughly right. Morphogenesis. How about morphogenesis? Not a single hand going up for morphogenesis. That's very interesting. Don't you think that's a bit weird? We'll have to give them a compulsory sunflower tutorial later, won't we?
We'll do it at lunch. Yes.
Yeah, we'll do that. Okay, so all right, go away and find out about Alan Turing and morphogenesis. That's why the morphogenesis slice is a bit smaller than, let's say, the code breaking slices. And there's some other things like marathon running. Any takers from marathon running? Okay, well, good, yes, right. Well, you can go and chase around the park later and do a demo. Okay, so, all right, as we've not got vast amounts of time to spend on each of these slices, I would put it to you that those perceptions, and roughly the number of hands that went up is consistent with the general public sort of perception about what Alan Turing is all about. And I would suggest that we can look at him in a slightly different way. So I have cut the cake differently. It's like a layer cake. I mean, those things are not necessarily wrong, those things that we talked about, but if this is a Victoria sponge and that's the sort of base layer, and then you've got a nice layer of sort of sticky stuff, and then you have another layer on the top, and because you can do this these days with 3D sort of, printers and all that kind of stuff, you can cut the slices on the top layer differently from the slices on the bottom layer. So here we go. I would suggest that if you don't look backwards at Alan Turing as a historical figure, but you think about what he should be standing for us in the 21st century, I think that's it's a less sepia-tinted, it's a less soppy way of looking at Alan Turing, and I think it's actually more vibrant and probably a bit more, I don't know, a bit more relevant, I would suggest. So we've got some other things here, and I started with education because actually I think for example, what's happening here at the museum, Alan Turing is being used as a sort of vehicle for
inspiration and education.
So, okay, let's give you some numbers. The number of young women presenting themselves for mathematics at A-level in England is declining. It's gone down from roughly 40% to somewhere in the high 30%. So gender balance. So that still more boys want to take maths A-level than girls, and it's getting worse. Why is that? You need to think about why that is. Why are people having conversations with girls aged 7, 8, 9, which is implanting in their minds that these are boys' subjects and they're not suitable for girls? That then manifests itself in gender imbalance when it comes to studying computer science. the number of women going into, well, we've got a question, come on, I'll shut up, go on.
Sorry, I just wanted to resolve, if I could, well, two things actually. Firstly, where does this come from, the ingraining into them that it's a boys' subject? Is it something at school, is it the media, or is it a mixture of different things? And my second question was, am I allowed to take photographs? Thank you.
Your second question was a damn sight easier than the first one. Okay. Well, I don't know, and the interesting thing is that the sociologists haven't really got to the bottom of this yet. But I have a suspicion, so I'll put this up there as a sort of hypothesis that people can then criticise, challenge, or whatever. I talked to lots of school teachers about this. And I genuinely don't believe that the problem is coming from schools. I think schools are actually fighting back against it. Yes, we all know from our experience with our own kids that schools, every teacher wants to get the best kids for their specialism for A-level. And so the French teacher will say, no, you don't want to do maths. And the maths teacher will say, no, you don't want to do French. And the sports teacher will say, no, you don't want to do anything that involves sitting in a classroom. So, you know, I mean, that competition is healthy, and I don't blame that for this problem. I think actually it's a societal thing. I think it's insidious little comments. Grandma said something once, you know, oh, you don't want to do that because you'd be sitting in a room full of spotty boys doing, you know, nasty, you know, they don't wash properly because they're studying computers. You know, I mean, it's that kind of thing that has to be squashed whenever it's heard. And people are too polite, and they say, well, it's just grandma off on one again. No, you have to say, she's just talking rubbish, you know, and there are, you know, and we need to provide role models to counterbalance what these kinds of daft things are. What I can't deal with, I mean, you can deal with grandma, but what you can't deal with quite so easily is what happens in the playground. And I think there's a sort of, you know, playgrounds are sort of big cauldron of sort of social normalisation, if you like, and I think that's a... All right, shall we move on from education, because we've got other cake slices here. Disadvantaged people. Can I ask you what is significant about what's happening here at the museum with regard to disadvantaged people? Because I suspect that these folks might be quite interested to hear what you're doing.
We decided as a museum and charity that you need to be accessible. So everyone in this room, I'm sure, who runs a business, goes to events, everything you do in your daily life, you need to be accessible. But sometimes we have tunnel vision where we stick to the, you know, the group that we know. And while we're here today, we're making this accessible. You're all meeting each other and networking. But for disadvantaged kids, we basically open the museum free of charge. Sponsors fund these kids to come in, learn, develop, grow with like-minded people the same age. So it doesn't matter what background, race you are from, you come in and do exactly the same as the, forgive me, privileged child that parents have got, you know, VR headsets and whatever else. And you might think just inviting one child that comes in and has 4 hours with a mentor isn't enough. But if we all did that and made it free, because we're in crisis again, financially, it would make a big difference. And it does really make a difference, because then that 4-year-old, we start as young as 4 now, that 4-year-old then will then tell her friend or his friend that they've been here. They then come, and it's how it grows. It's talk to people. People buy from people, and you work together. So disadvantage, I mean, it's not just having no money, it's other areas. So we work with the neurodiverse community. I mean, you all know this, cybersecurity, computing, forgive me, it was not fashionable to employ someone that had Asperger's or autism. You're ashamed, you're not in interviews. My goodness, have we missed the trick? You know, our pool of people are very much on the spectrum at a high level, and they are absolutely awesome. So yeah, when we say disadvantaged, I think it's just not being accepted in society. We do it well.
Alan Turing as being somebody who was just not quite sort of, well, he certainly didn't think the way that regular people think. So,
did Alan Turing have Asperger's?
Oh, all right. So well, let's deal with this. Okay. So Benedict Cumberbatch plays somebody who is definitely on the spectrum. Does anybody not know what I'm talking about? Okay, well, they're all too ashamed to admit that they haven't seen the movie, so it's all right if you haven't seen. There are some people who absolutely won't see the movie because they know it's trash, which is interesting thought. But anyway, there we go. So Benedict Cumberbatch obviously got that notion from somewhere, but I suggest that he got it from the script that he was, the screenplay that he was actually playing to. The screenplay purports to be the screenplay of Andrew Hodges' seminal biography of Alan Turing. Andrew Hodges is one of the people who refuses to see the movie. That tells you something, doesn't it? So there is, well, to answer your question more directly, I think we have to recognise that in the 1940s and 1950s, conditions like Asperger's syndrome and being on the spectrum had not yet been invented. So that means that there is no evidential basis for making that sort of diagnosis. So nobody was collecting the information that you would look, on the signs that you would look for today. So Benedict Cumberbatch may well have got it, but because he was playing the part so well, but that doesn't tell us anything about Alan Turing. So what do we know about Alan Turing? Actually, I've been through here's the thing on the autism spectrum. The diagnostic criteria change about every 3 or 4 years. So you may say no this year and yes next year and no the year after. So it's very confusing. But if you look at the current set of criteria, basically he doesn't have it because he doesn't tick any of the relevant boxes from what I know anyway. So that's all a bit. It's all a bit weird. I mean, the fact that he doesn't say good morning to people because A, he's an intellectual snob, B, he's thinking about something else, and C, he's not very good at making eye contact with people. That doesn't put him on the spectrum, or maybe it does, but right at the bottom. I mean, but does it matter, frankly? I mean, this is a thing. I mean, I think actually he's not a disadvantaged person in the sense that you were talking about. Comes from upper middle class background, I mean, this is sort of difficult to think about because somebody who was born in 1912 spoke like a BBC announcer from the wartime years. And you think about that, and there's no recordings of him, but there's recordings of my father talking, and that's quite embarrassing, really. I mean, it's all fretfully, and I mean, it really is sort of BBC cricket announcers from the early 1950s. And you think, oh my God, could I actually have worked with somebody like that? So, but of course, everybody was talking like that then. So yes, it's all you have to sort of get with the sort of what life was like 100 years ago. It was a bit different from what it is now. I'm conscious. There's one more cake slice I should like to talk about, and then we should probably invite these good folks to pitch. Mm-hmm. Questions to us. So, all right, can I do one more then? Yes. The one I should like to do is called Info Security, which I rated at 4% because there's a lesser known fact about Alan Turing, which let's explore it this way. So put your hands back up if you think that Alan Turing is a code breaker. All right. Has anybody not put their hand up? Because that would be a very, very interesting person to talk to. Okay. All right. No, can't. No, all right. Okay. So the reason we think that Alan Turing is a code breaker is because he's associated very strongly with being at Bletchley Park and inventing the Bombe machine, which if you haven't seen the demo of yet, then I'm sure you will get the opportunity to do that later today. And so that's all cool and very interesting. But all right, let's take. Let's do this in sort of a slightly perverse way. Put your hand up if you think the Bombe machine became live in 1944. 43? 42? Okay, we've got a few more votes for 42. 41? 1940? Okay, that's very interesting. So you're all hopelessly brainwashed by watching the Imitation Game movie. The answer is that Alan Turing's design was in the hands of the engineers by November of 1939. The prototype was delivered to Bletchley Park in March of 1940. It didn't work especially well, and with Gordon Welshman's modification of it, it became live and was producing Enigma settings by the time of the Battle of Britain, so the summer of 1940. So, okay. So the imitation game gives you this completely fake, it doesn't say anything, so there's no dates, but it gives you this sense that it came online just in time to save countless American lives on the beaches of Normandy. I mean, that's kind of the subtext of it, because the screenplay was, of course, written by an American. So it's all very interesting, but it doesn't say that, but there's an insidious sort of undercurrent there. And to actually find the blueprints from November, dated with November 1939 dates on them, is kind of that's kind of cool. So, all right. So that then raises. I am coming back to this piece of cake. I'm going by a very roundabout route, but I'm getting there. So that raises a sort of slightly different question. Well, if Alan Turing had finished inventing bombs in the first few months of World War II, what the hell was he doing for the rest of World War II? There's still another 5.5 years of it to go. And the answer is that by 1942, he had moved over to something that these days we would call cybersecurity. By 1942, Bletchley Park had figured out that they had a cybersecurity problem. I didn't call it that in those days, they called it cipher security. So we just changed the spelling slightly. But so they realized that the Germans were reading the British codes. And they say, no, he's got that, this is the wrong way round. The Germans were reading the British codes. How did the British find out that the Germans were reading the British codes? Any suggestions?
Operation Meatball?
Oh, I've no idea what Operation Meatball is. So maybe you're right, but I don't know what that is. So
Were they relaying the information that decoded by messages to their own troops?
absolutely. So this is the thing. This is where cybersecurity gets really quite interesting. We knew that the Germans were reading our codes because we were reading their codes, in which they revealed what the. So that then starts to hang on. But if they're reading our codes and we're reading their codes at the same time, this is going to disappear into a vortex of something completely incomprehensible and unravelable. But the long and the short of this is that by the middle of 1942, Bletchley Park set up a whole unit dedicated to cipher security, and it consisted of a guy called Lieutenant Commander Russell Dudley Smith and his assistant Margaret Story. Margaret's a great character. She's chain smoking and she's foul mouthed, and so great. So I'm like the first. So there we are. This is the birth of what you guys do for a living, which is cybersecurity. The birthplace of that too was here at Bletchley Park. Not just the birthplace of hacking, but the birthplace of counter hacking. And so this is quite interesting. I mean, eventually Dudley Smith's department got a bit bigger, and Margaret had somebody to take the ashtray out, which was great. So I think this is all really quite interesting. And then eventually, gradually, very slowly, the British codes got a bit more secure. I mean, it's really quite interesting how easily crackable the British stuff was. But anyway, so I thought that was quite interesting. And Alan Turing then goes over to the code creation side of the fence rather than the code breaking side of the fence. So that's what he's doing for the rest of the war. All right. So I've done my cake.
Would anyone like to ask a question? You must have questions, guys. So you all think that you are literally smashing this whole scenario of cybersecurity. You don't think Alan Turing is relevant? He hasn't impacted your businesses, your lives?
I have a question, if I may. You know, on your slides of the cake, women tech,
Yeah.
the effect of this historical point. Could you please expand on that?
Yeah. Okay, so again, you've got this sort of sense of Alan Turing being somebody who doesn't understand when he's been given a lunch invitation, and you would probably conclude he's a bit of a misogynist. So, interesting hypothesis there. The way I look at it is rather different, actually, because we have to accept that society was a bit different in the 1940s and 50s from how it is now. But Alan Turing's research assistants and PhD students, when he was at Manchester, which was basically the last 5 years of his life, Bernard Richards was Alan Turing was supervising his PhD, but he also had two other research assistants, both of whom were either working towards masters or doctoral degrees, and they were both women. And he was also informally supervising the world's first person of either gender in any country to receive a PhD in computer science, a lady called Beatrice Worsley, who is Canadian. She had worked with Maurice Wilkes at Cambridge, and there's some legacy of the kind of thing that she was working on behind you. Wilkes and Turing famously didn't get on, and very interestingly, because there were so few people who actually knew about computing machinery and computer programming in those days, she was, even though she was at Cambridge, she was quite happily corresponding with Alan Turing at Manchester. And the correspondence is just absolutely hilarious because she's putting in these sort of wry comments of saying, I'm not sure that you cope with this because it is a bit sort of Cambridge way of doing things. And so it's a sort of nod to the sort of Wilkes-Turing sort of debate going on. But they're hitting it off famously, and they carry on corresponding after Beatrice goes back to Ottawa. So, you know, he's like sort of an informal consultant on her PhD. She's the first person of either gender in the world to have received a PhD in computer science. And I think this is really quite interesting. He's getting on famously with people of both genders. It's really a question of whether you click, whether you're talking about the same kind of stuff. And frankly, you know, if you want to go and talk to Alan Turing about the Celtic Rangers fixture, then you know, kind of he's going to switch off and probably leave the room. But that's kind of fine. But you know, if you want to talk about whether you could actually create a program for that thing to play a game of chess, then you probably won't be out of the pub for the next 3 hours. But so you know, I think this is quite interesting because it does connect back into this whole sort of women in tech thing, because that is very interesting to consider that the women who were doing high-powered jobs, and they weren't all just machinery operators, the women who were doing high-powered jobs at Bletchley Park went on to try to do high-powered things in both in code breaking or in technology, and society decided that this was inappropriate. Married women had to retire. That was the coy word that was used. If you got married, the woman was expected to retire from her job so that she could devote herself to housekeeping. And so there's some great books about women who were computer programmers in the early 1950s, because staffing policy required women to retire. So you've got 25-year-old, 30-year-old women who are actually experts in computer programming who are being forced out of the workplace. And at the same time, the newspapers are full of calamitous stories about how we don't have enough computer programmers in the UK. Thinking, the solution is staring you in the face, guys. You know? It's really very, very interesting. So, I mean, and this went right on into the 1970s. I mean, the early 70s, there's pictures of sort of mini-skirted computer programming girls, you know, wearing sort of bubblegum coloured sort of PVC type boots, and they're clearly in their 20s, and they're at their retirement party because they're being forced out because they've got married. And it's just completely and utterly bonkers. But anyway, so we're through that now in terms of the sort of structural side of things, but we're not through it in terms of the cultural thing, which is, so this thing we were talking about earlier, where girls are being put off doing this thing, I mean, this is a modern construct. It's not always been there. It's a modern problem. And so, yeah, all right, we've got another one over there. Yes, please.
Well, and on that point, what's happening here to kind of encourage girls then? Because it's really interesting how they explain, but I see the focuses on like Alan Turing and stuff, and it would be nice to see a little bit of focus with some of the women that were there and that had these great careers and walked out of it. So I just wonder if there's anything that you have to get girls interested in things like mathematics and tech.
Well, absolutely. Unfortunately, our mission is to power the past and fuel the future. That's like kind of my mission, or the museum's mission. But actually, when you look back in history, forgive me, we always talk about Alan Turing, but we should be talking about Bill Tart, Gordon Welshman. They're all males, and unfortunately, us women were left to do these roles. Women were typists in 1940. Okay, they were smarter, and typists were really important. But what we do at the museum now is that we have got people. We've got Hedy Lamarr, we've got Dina St Johnson. There are lots of amazing, great women. There are women here in the room today, actually. You're doing it, you're good advocates. But for us, what we do is trying to celebrate the past. We always try and recognise everybody, whether you're male, female, it doesn't matter what gender or colour, that's it. That's what we do. But we basically just allow young women, if we're talking about just women, to come in and leave knowing they can, because that's the problem. When I was at school, for example, a long time ago, I didn't do computing. I couldn't type when I came here because I wasn't pushed that way. I was pushed to try and become a hairdresser. That's what my parents said. My work experience was in a hairdresser's. I became a fishmonger, by the way, but, and that's true. But that was the thing. Unfortunately, it's installed in us from generations and generations. My grandma and my granddad said, you will go and be a hairdresser. So all we can do is encourage people to come, engage and show them and allow them to get hands-on. I'm very much about hands-on. I don't think dictating with PowerPoint and slides to young people it works. I don't learn. I think they should touch, and engage and experience something by physically building and creating and programming. So we do an awful lot. We did start with Dame Steve Shirley. We opened a Women in Computing gallery. What a mistake. We opened a small room and put a load of women in there and said, please come and celebrate. We went back to the 1940s, we put them in a box again. So what we did is we pulled that Women in Computing gallery out of the museum, and now we represent women in every decade throughout everything. And yes, we have got an advert in the gallery next door which shows women, beautiful women in hot miniskirts, showing the large systems, machines or what have you. But we're doing that to show that that was what was happening then. But now we've got young women, online or in the museum, showcasing what they've built and what they've programmed. I mean, a 5-year-old that can come in and program the old Snake game on a BBC from the 80s. That gives me goosebumps. A 5-year-old. That's what we're doing. So we are making an impact. We do need industry to help. If I wrote to all of you tomorrow and said, will you come in and be a mentor for a day? We've got 27-year-olds coming in. Would you say yes, or would you say you're too busy? So, yeah, we're doing okay, but we do need you to help.
Yeah, I think you've got some. I mean, just what you said about the women gallery thing. I mean, I'm delighted you did that. Because people never found their way to it either, because it was sort of like so having the women actually in the heart of the stories from the past is actually quite interesting. I'd like to say just one final thing, and this is another piece of Bletchley Park myth busting, if you like. So the traditional picture of code breakers at Bletchley Park is that the code breakers, well, they're all male. They wear tweed jackets. They come from Oxbridge colleges and they smoke pipes. That's not untrue, but when you look at the women, then you think, oh, well, they're all bomb operators or they're Typex operators. So when the Enigma settings were found, then somebody actually had to sit down and with the intercepts and actually type them into basically a Typex machine that had been rigged to behave like an Enigma. Okay, so
Carry on, finish this bit.
Okay, so there were Typex operators basically decoding the Enigma messages. And that, again, that's not wrong, but what it fails to give credits to is the women who were also code breakers and intelligence analysts. And the reason that they don't get any credit is you go to the archives and you look at the staff documents, women were not allowed to do men's jobs. All job descriptions were genderized, so the code breakers' jobs were reserved for men. So if you were a woman code breaker, you couldn't be called a code breaker, you had to be called what women were allowed to do. So that meant they were called translators or linguists or typists. And so there's millions of people who've got clerical staff job descriptions who are actually doing code breaking. So Joan Clark, for example, probably one of the most famous women code breakers at Bletchley Park, but one of many dozen women code breakers. So she's not the only one, but just pick her as an example. She's a mathematician. To get her a pay rise, they needed to give her a better job, but she couldn't become a junior assistant, which was what the technical description for a code breaker was, because you can't call them code breakers because it's secret, so you call them junior assistant, which is so vague that nobody knows. But junior assistants have to be men. Joan Clark wasn't a man, so she couldn't be a junior assistant. So how did they give her a pay rise? So her ultimate boss, Edward Travis, who later became the head of Bletchley Park, said, I've got an idea. Apply to be a linguist, and then we can get you an extra 30 shillings a week. So she applied to be a linguist. She filled in a form. Job applied for, linguist. Language skills, she put none. You know, so it's great. so you know, they found ways around the system, but it does mean that the people who go, historians who go and look at the archives, will find misleading stuff. So again, we can sort of celebrate people who, you know, did amazing things, and yes, they've just been overlooked by history. Right, you're telling me that Stephen Hawking said that it was 10:30 and I should shut up.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
Just to let you know, Dermot's going to be here all day, and you can obviously have a chat, ask any questions that you weren't brave enough to ask. But thank you very, very much.
Right. Thank you.